Let us look at the latest on the battle for Ukraine. An expert military perspective for you this morning. He is retired general. He was the chief of defense staff, served in that capacity until 2008. Right now, he leads the International Advisory Council at Quest. Retired General Rick Hillier joining us from Florida this morning. Sir, welcome back and good to see you today.
Heather, thank you.
I want to begin with the capital, if we can, General Hillier. Basically, this is a city that's become a fortress. Everyone anticipating an assault on Kiev is the word that we've had. And we have this convoy, which is sitting there, still stalled, basically about 20 kilometers away from the capital. I'm just wondering, from the Pentagon yesterday, they have, it seems, all of the troops in the field, and here it sits. What do you think is really going on here? Are they really regrouping? Does this give Ukraine a strategic advantage, or is it merely delaying the inevitable? What do you think?
Well, Heather, I think, first of all, it is delaying the inevitable unless we do something from the West to really help the Ukraine change the dynamic there, change the equation. But I think it reflects two things. Number one, the very surprising to most observers resistance that has come from the Ukrainian Defense Forces. And I think maybe over the last several years, most of the pessimism about their capabilities came from NATO assessment officers who were training them. And I think some of that negativity came because the Ukrainians insisted on staying with the former Soviet Union military tactics and deployments and structure. And maybe we were just a little arrogant in thinking that it had to be NATO in order to be good. The Ukrainian Defense Forces have been incredible in their fight for their country and for their survivors. I think that's the first thing that this column and this slowness kind of sort of shows us. The second thing, perhaps even more importantly, but certainly as importantly, it shows us just what a mess the Russian army is and what a sort of great challenge they have in putting together those bigger scale attacks and motivating their soldiers to go forward and do something which perhaps those soldiers either don't know about or don't believe in. And you've got things like logistics that fall apart, leadership that doesn't show up, soldiers that don't want to do their job. And so I think it's a combination of several things, but it does delay the inevitable, the overwhelming force that the Russians can bring through a period of time, switching, as we've seen through some of the video you just showed, and to some of the other things we know about, switching to a sledgehammer sort of tactics of just smashing towns and cities and destroying buildings and destroying infrastructure and not worrying about collateral damage or civilian casualties. I think that will change, sadly, the tenor greatly here. And it already has started to do that as we see those incredible, horribly tragic refugee columns and the deaths that we see in those areas. The Russians are using a sledgehammer right now.
We're just looking at, we should just make it clear, that was a Russian helicopter that was shut down. We're just looking at a number of shots of the battle, so we have to be clear about what we're showing people as we talk. The expectation is the hammering of cities in Ukraine and civilian targets will increase. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are. The Pentagon was commenting yesterday that Russia seems to be recruiting troops in Syria because fighters there have skill in urban combat fighting. Now, what might that signal to you?
An act of desperation, really, as they finally realize that most of their fighting, or the crucial fighting, is going to take place in those urban areas and fighting in built-up areas, as we call it in the military. And that's the toughest kind of fighting, where you're at close quarters with an enemy who shoots and runs, shoots and runs, shoots and runs. You continuously take casualties. The rubble that you create as part of that fight actually becomes an obstacle to your movement. You cannot use your best weapon systems as effectively, those big tanks and the artillery pieces, because they're hard to get into position. And so if you don't have the expertise in it, as many militaries do not, it becomes a real tough fight. And the defender has many of the advantages, particularly if they're dedicated, which the Ukrainians are, and if they have the right equipments to do the job.
Well, equipment, let's talk about that. In recent days, we have been hearing about pretty much a non-stop flow of planes coming into Poland, Canada sending one in just a matter of minutes, actually, with arms, lethal and non-lethal aid, but sending into Poland for movement into Ukraine, tens of thousands of Stingers and Javelins, anti-tank, anti-air missiles, and all sorts of ammunitions. Are they getting enough? And is it the right weaponry right now to make a difference?
First of all, no, they're not getting enough. And secondly, it's not all the right weaponry to make the kind of difference. There are several ways to approach this, but number one is the fact that you don't want to be giving, right at this second, I don't believe, the Ukrainian Defense Forces weapons that they don't already have and have not trained their soldiers to utilize and don't have experience with. And so, fortunately, many of the javelins, which is a long-distance, very accurate anti-tank weapon system, which has been used effectively already, we've seen that. It was into the Ukrainian Defense Forces before the actual fighting started, so they've got some training on it. Their soldiers have acquired some expertise with it already, and therefore you can add as many more as you can get into the country as you possibly can. They've got the Mark 19 automatic grenade launcher, but they need ammunition for that one, lots of ammunition. What you don't really want to do is add in things that they don't have right now, because it's really challenging while you're fighting a war to train up on new weapon systems and bring them into operations itself. So, they don't have enough. They need more of it.
Okay, that makes sense in light of what I want to ask you next. So you talked about how perhaps the Soviet approach to defense and Soviet-style equipment on which they have training. So there is a push now to get the Ukrainian fighters more fighter planes, more fighter jets, MiGs, Sukhois, et cetera. And what they're talking about is moving in NATO planes, U.S. planes, F-16s into Poland, and then Poland moving some of those Soviet-style jets into Ukraine for the very reason you just said, which is the pilots have experience on that kind of aircraft. Is that a plan that makes sense to you at this point?
Well, I think the best thing to do would be ask either the president of Ukraine or their commanders, would you want those Soviet-era planes, which are modernized, which are operational and ready to go, and with which you have experience? And the answer would be overwhelmingly yes. They need that air capability. They need to be able to strike those long columns that are lined up north of Kyiv and other places. And they need to be able to do all the things to keep the Russians and the enemy away from their cities and towns and actually survive as a nation. So I think it would be a wonderful thing to do. And it goes along the line of what I said earlier. Give them the things that they already know as opposed to something brand new. Let NATO worry about the geopolitical game outside of that, about whether more fighters go into Poland to replace them. But we've got so many aircraft and fighter aircraft in NATO that we could swamp Eastern Europe, the countries of NATO, with them should we desire to do that.
So we'll watch that. That seems to be something that Antony Blinken, for example, has been talking about of late in other countries. And certainly Ukraine government officials have been asking for planes, if no-fly zone. And I know your voice has been one advocating a no-fly zone. It's been one of the rare voices. But I'm wondering, there's a little bit of movement on this today, an interesting development. In the States, there are 27 foreign policy experts. This is according, I should mention, General Hillier, to a report that's exclusively in Politico, just in the past few minutes. But these foreign policy experts, will pull up some on screen, have signed an open letter to the Biden administration calling for a limited no-fly zone to protect these humanitarian corridors which are coming under fire, these corridors that both Russia and Ukraine have agreed to. And in the wording of this open letter, you have to specify to Russian officials they do not seek direct confrontation, but make it clear they will not countenance Russian attacks on civil areas. So limited no-fly zone in that context. Is there value in that?
Well, let me just expand it a little bit, William. I've been calling for a no-fly zone now since actually prior to the crisis itself and the invasion of Ukraine by the Russians. I'm a believer in the sanctions and all the economic measures and diplomatic measures that we've taken across the world to really constrain the Russians. And that's really awesome, but it will have an impact weeks, months, or years down the road. And what it is not going to do is help Ukraine in the short term here. And in that regard, we've given them complete assistance short of real help. And what they need are some things to actually keep the technological advantage that perhaps the Russians have off their back. The no-fly zone would be exactly that. Look, we're going to stand by and watch the Ukraine be demolished, destroyed in Europe in 2022, and really do nothing of consequence in the short term. Start off with a limited no-fly zone, and all of those things, you always can make the message or put the message out that, no, we're not seeking a direct confrontation with you, but we are going to protect those refugee columns. And then expand that and say, hey, we're going to land airplanes carrying Javelin missiles and humanitarian assistance and blankets and helmets and all those kinds of things. And we're going to put air cover over that. And then expand it to Western Ukraine and say, we're going to give this as a humanitarian area, and then perhaps expand it over all Ukraine. I'm in favor of a no-fly zone. I think we have to confront Putin right now. Otherwise, every time he looks at us and says he'll do something bad, we're going to roll over. we should be asking him how far he wants to go. Does he want to go to the English Channel? And so I'm in favor of the no-fly zone. I think a step-by-step implementation of it, much as you suggested, starting with humanitarian corridors, but actually putting it probably on the western part of Ukraine to start with would be a good first step.
So just before I let you go, because I do have to, just raising that point, I'm just wondering, most of the voices from the Biden administration right through NATO officials, our own government officials, concern about how that could lead to open military conflict between the West and Russia. What are you seeing that you're able to discount that concern?
I think we're into open military conflict with Russia in a very real way. Let's go back years here. He's assassinating and murdering people in countries in NATO throughout these past years because he doesn't like what they did or like things that they did that he perceives against him or Russia. Mm-hmm. He does what he wants, and we will have to confront him. Putin wants to survive. He's not going to do something that's really out on the edge because he wants to survive. And, people like that, they watch what we do. They watched what happened in Afghanistan last August and what a debacle that was for the West. And he sees us as weak, and he keeps pushing. We've had some great coming together as the Western nations here, and the sanctions, again, are wonderful things. Now let's just step it up one more. And look, we need to stand by a nation of, 43, 44 million who are being destroyed and murdered and brutalized on an hourly basis by the Russian invading forces. Let's help them out.